They said humanity was too fractured, too slow, too soft to fight back. They were wrong. The Kroll Dominion thought no one would come when they burned our colony to the ground. But now their skies are on fire, their worlds trembling under boots they never expected to see. This isn't a rescue, this is retribution, and it started the moment they made the mistake of thinking humans wouldn't fight for their own. What happens when the most underestimated species in the galaxy decides it's done being prey? The silence of space hung heavy over the battered colony. The planet, once a thriving human settlement, lay in ruins under the iron grip of the Kroll Dominion. The alien overlords had stormed in without mercy, their fleet blotting out the sky like an omen of doom. The people of Ardent Prime had sent distress signals, desperate pleas for help, but deep down they had already given up. No one was coming. The Solaris Accord had never intervened in Outer Rim conflicts. Sol's fleet, though powerful, rarely wasted resources on a single colony. Not when it could mean risking war with the Kroll Ardent Prime was expendable. At least that's what the Kroll believed. Commander Zarnak, the reptilian warlord overseeing the occupation, watched his soldiers round up the last of the human survivors, his forked tongue flicked in satisfaction. Pathetic creatures, he hissed. No fight left in them, no allies, no hope. But as the Kroll tightened their grip, something changed. The air itself seemed to hum with tension. Then the sky darkened, not from smoke or storm, but from something vast, something unnatural. A ripple of space distortion cracked the sky open, and in its place, an armada emerged. Not just any fleet, Sol's supreme fleet. The flagship, Tyrant's Fall, led the way, a behemoth of steel and vengeance. Its hull gleamed in the dying light of the planet, its cannons humming with the energy of 1,000 battles. Following close behind were dreadnoughts, carriers, and war frigates, each bearing the unyielding emblem of the Solaris Accord. The Kroll scoffed at first. Just another fleet, another nuisance. But as their scanners registered the sheer firepower, as their comms channels exploded with frantic warnings, the truth became clear. This was not a rescue mission, this was retribution. The Supreme Fleet had not come to negotiate. It had not come to plead for mercy. It had come to make a statement, a simple, brutal statement written in fire and blood. And it was a statement the Kroll would never forget. The battle began before the Kroll even had time to react. The Tyrant's Fall unleashed a barrage that shattered the sky, vaporizing the lead Kroll battleships in an instant. Railguns fired in perfect synchrony, cutting through enemy armor like paper. Swarms of Solarian fighters darted between the enemy ranks, carving through Kroll defenses with merciless precision. The Kroll fleet scrambled, sending out panicked orders, but it was too late. The Supreme Fleet moved like a pack of wolves, coordinated and relentless. The Kroll, for all their pride, for all their strength, had never fought an enemy like this. Humans did not fight fair. Humans did not fight to win. Humans fought to destroy. Commander Zarnak watched in horror as his fleet was reduced to burning debris. He had heard whispers of Sol's military might of the Supreme Fleet, but he had never believed them. The Kroll were conquerors. They had crushed species far older and more advanced than humanity. But none of them had been like this. None of them had been human. And now the Kroll had made the worst mistake of their existence. They had made humans angry. The battle above Ardent Prime raged on, but calling it a battle was generous. It was a massacre. Kroll ships erupted in blinding infernos of fire and debris, their hulls torn apart by the relentless assault of Sol's Supreme Fleet. Fighters weaved through the wreckage, systematically hunting down survivors. The Kroll, so used to being the predators, were now the prey. Commander Zarnak clutched the edges of his war table, his claws digging into the metal. His command center, buried beneath the planet's surface, was filled with the desperate chatter of officers, screaming into their comms, pleading for reinforcements, for escape. Anything but the Supreme Fleet had cut off all routes of retreat. There would be no reinforcements, no surrender. Zarnak bared his fangs, seething. How did they get here so fast? A trembling officer beside him swallowed hard. We intercepted their transmissions, Commander. The Supreme Fleet wasn't stationed near Ardent Prime. They came from Sol itself. Zarnak turned sharply. Do you mean to tell me they crossed half the galaxy for a colony? The officer hesitated before nodding. Yes, Commander. Zarnak's blood ran cold. That distance should have taken weeks to traverse, even for the most advanced species, but the Terrans had done it in days. The humans had warp technology that defied all logic, and they used it to hunt them down. A new message appeared on their main screen. A transmission hijacks their comms, overriding all crawl frequencies. The static buzzed for a moment before resolving into an image. A human stood before them. Not just any human. Grand Admiral Aaron Thorne, Supreme Commander of Sol's forces. He was clad in the black and gold uniform of the fleet, his silver hair swept back in perfect order, his expression unreadable. Cold. Calculated.
This is Grand Admiral Thorne of the Solaris Accord, he said, his voice sharp as a blade. Your forces have invaded our colony. You have slaughtered our citizens, enslaved our citizens, and assumed that no one would come. A pause. Then his icy blue eyes locked onto the screen. You were wrong, Zarnak snarled, slamming a fist on the table. Human, you are interfering in Kral Dominion affairs. You will withdraw your fleet immediately, or we will... You will. What? Thorne's voice didn't rise, but it carried a weight that crushed any retort before it could leave Zarnak's throat. You will threaten us? The Supreme Fleet is not here to negotiate. We are here to end you. Zarnak bared his fangs. Do you dare challenge the Kral Dominion? We are an empire. You cannot win against us. Thorne tilted his head slightly. You mistake me. Commander Zarnak, this isn't about winning. This is about punishment. The line cut. Zarnak barely had time to process what was happening before the sky above the command center turned white. A blinding flash erupted from the heavens and the earth shook. The Kral officers in the war room screamed as tremors rocked the base, causing screens to flicker and walls to crack. Then the world split open. The Supreme Fleet had deployed their orbital cannons, the planetary bombardment of an unprecedented scale. Cities occupied by the Kral were turned to glass. In an instant, Kral strongholds crumbled into molten slag. The war factories, the very infrastructure that allowed them to dominate this world, were obliterated in minutes. Zarnak stumbled forward, his mind reeling. This wasn't how humans fought. They were supposed to be weak and inferior. They were supposed to fear the Kral. But the Terrans did not fear, they avenged. Above the Supreme Fleet advanced. They had not come merely to rescue Ardent Prime. They had come to make an example out of the Kral Dominion, and that example was written in fire. Zarnak could barely think as the ground beneath him trembled. The war room's alarms blared, red lights flashing in a frantic, desperate warning. His officers shouted over one another, their voices full of panic. The Supreme Fleet was not just bombing strategic targets anymore. They were purging the Kral from the planet, erasing every trace of their occupation with ruthless precision. He stumbled to a nearby console, his claws tapping furiously against the interface. He needed to see how bad it was. The holomap flickered to life, showing Ardent Prime in real time. It was worse than he had imagined. Entire Kral battalions were being annihilated. Solarian dropships had already landed in key locations, unleashing shock troopers, heavily armored warriors wielding weapons far deadlier than anything the Kral had ever seen. The Kral's foot soldiers tried to regroup, to push back against the invaders,
but they were met with pure brutality. Solarian infantry didn't march forward in rigid formations like the Kral. They moved like ghosts, striking from the shadows, appearing where they were least expected. Kral commanders barked orders over the comms, only for their voices to be silenced by a single, well-placed bullet. Zarnak's breath came in ragged gasps. The Kral Dominion had fought many species before, but none like this, none who fought with such calculated, unrelenting rage. A lieutenant ran up to him, his yellow scales pale with terror. "Commander, the orbital strikes have breached our lower defenses. The humans, they're coming here." Zarnak's heart pounded. He turned back to the hollow map. It showed a new fleet of transport ships descending toward their command bunker. They bore the insignia of the Solarian Special Forces, a personal strike team. They weren't just here to destroy the Kral forces, they were coming for him. He spun toward his remaining officers. "We evacuate now." But it was already too late. The reinforced doors of the war room exploded inward, the blast throwing several Kral soldiers off their feet. Smoke filled the chamber, and through the haze they emerged. Solarian soldiers clad in dark combat armor, their visors glowing a menacing red. They moved with cold mechanical efficiency, gunning down Kral warriors before they could even raise their weapons. Zarnak reached for his own blade, but something heavy struck him in the chest, forcing him to his knees. He gasped, looking up only to find himself staring into the barrel of a Solarian rifle. Behind it stood a soldier, but not just any soldier, Admiral Aaron Thorne himself. His gaze was unreadable, his expression void of mercy. His rifle remained steady, unshaken. Zarnak bared his fangs. "Do you think killing me will stop the Dominion? Do you think we won't retaliate?" Thorne's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Retaliate. He let the word linger before he leaned in slightly. "Your Dominion has already been lost," Zarnak growled, but Thorne continued. "You thought no one would come. You thought we would leave Ardent Prime to die." His voice was calm, but there was something deeper beneath it, something icy and absolute. "But here's the thing about humans, Zarnak." He straightened his finger, tightening on the trigger. "We never forget." The shot rang out, and Commander Zarnak, once a warlord of the Kral Dominion, collapsed lifelessly to the floor. Silence filled the war room. The Solarian soldiers didn't cheer, didn't gloat. They simply turned and left. Their work was done. Outside, Ardent Prime burned, but this time it was the Kral who were the ones reduced to ashes. The battle for Ardent Prime was over. The Supreme Fleet had done more than win. They had erased the Kral presence from the planet. Smoke still curled from the ruins of Kral war machines, and the air carried the acrid scent of burning wreckage. The once dominant reptilian invaders now lay broken, their bodies scattered like discarded refuse. For the first time in weeks, the sky above Ardent Prime was clear, and in that sky the Solarian warships loomed, silent, watchful, a reminder to anyone who dared to cross humanity. Admiral Thorne stepped out of the shattered Kral war room, his boots crunching against debris. His soldiers moved with quiet precision, securing what little remained of the enemy command. There was no need for celebration. This was not a victory. It was justice. He raised a hand to his comms status report. A voice crackled in his earpiece. "Sir, all Kral resistance has been neutralized. Their fleet is gone. Ground forces were annihilated. Ardent Prime is ours again." Thorne exhaled slowly, allowing himself a rare moment of relief. "And the civilians? We're sweeping through the shelters now. Some are wounded, but we got here before the Kral could finish their purge." A pause, then a softer tone. "They're alive, sir. Alive." That was why they had come. That was why they had crossed half the galaxy in record time, because humanity takes care of its own. Thorne turned his gaze to the horizon where plumes, ascendant plumes of smoke, still curled toward the heavens. The Crawl had thought they could wipe out a Solarian colony and walk away unchallenged. Now they would learn a lesson they would never forget. He opened a new channel this time, broadcasting beyond Ardent Prime, beyond even the Supreme Fleet. He knew who would be listening.
"This is Grand Admiral Aaron Thorne of the Solaris Accord," he began, his voice steady, unwavering. "Let this be a message to the Kral Dominion and to anyone who believes humanity is weak." He let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. "We do not forgive. We do not forget. And when you come for us, we will come for you." The transmission ended. The warships above began their final sweeps, ensuring no Kral survivors remained. The Supreme Fleet had come, and now it would leave its purpose fulfilled. But the galaxy would not forget this day. The Kral Dominion had underestimated humanity, and now they would never make that mistake again. The fires of war still smoldered across Ardent Prime, but the colony stood victorious. For the first time in weeks, the surviving humans stepped out of their shelters, blinking into the light of a sky no longer dominated by enemy ships. They had heard the bombardments, felt the ground shake beneath them, and listened as Kral voices screamed their last desperate orders. But now all was silent. The Supreme Fleet had come, and in its wake, the Kral were gone. Grand Admiral Cale Thorne watched from the command outpost as medical teams fanned out through the ruins. Civilians were pulled from underground bunkers, eyes wide with disbelief. Many had expected to die here. Some had already resigned themselves to a slow, agonizing end under Kral rule, and yet humanity had come for them. Thorne's eyes scanned the landscape. Ardent Prime had been a prosperous colony once, a beacon of Solarian resilience in the Outer Rim. Now it was scarred and battered, and its once thriving cities reduced to husks of steel and stone. The Crawl had left nothing untouched. He clenched his fists. This was more than an occupation. This had been extermination. The Supreme Fleet's retaliation had been absolute, but Thorne knew this was far from over. The Kral Dominion would not ignore this humiliation. If anything, they would return with fury. Good, let them come. The Solaris Accord had been content to keep to itself, to build its strength in silence, to avoid unnecessary conflicts. But the Kral had mistaken that restraint for weakness. Now humanity had delivered a reckoning, and Thorne intended to make sure the entire galaxy heard it. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Sir." He turned to see Captain Dahlia Vale standing at attention. Her armor was scratched, to her face smudged with soot, but her posture remained straight and disciplined. She had led the first wave of ground forces into the colony, carving through Kral defenses with ruthless efficiency. "The last of the Kral resistance has been annihilated," she reported. "No survivors. The civilians are secure, and the med teams are working on evacuation for the wounded." Thorne nodded, his gaze lingering on the ruins beyond. Casualties Vale hesitated. "We lost over 200 troops in the assault," she paused, before adding. "And the colony, it suffered heavy losses. We estimate nearly 70% of the population was annihilated before we arrived." Thorne exhaled sharply. It wasn't unexpected, but that didn't make it easier to hear. Vale continued, her voice tight. "They executed most of the leadership days ago publicly. The rest were executed without mercy." Thorne's jaw tightened. He didn't need to hear the details. He had seen what the Crawl did to those they conquered. "They thought no one would come," Vale said quietly. He looked at her. There was something hard in her expression, something deeply personal. She, like so many others, had lost people to the Kral over the years. Humanity had tolerated the Dominion's aggression for too long. Not anymore. Thorne turned back to the battlefield. The Supreme Fleet loomed overhead, casting shadows over a planet that had just been reclaimed. But the war was far from over.
"This isn't just about Ardent Prime," he said finally. "The Kroll won't let this stand." Vale nodded. "Then, what's our next move?" Thorn didn't answer right away. Instead, he activated his personal comm and patched into the fleet-wide channel. "All ships prepare for immediate departure. Ardent Prime is secure, but we're not done." There was a brief silence before the acknowledgements came through. Across the planet, soldiers and officers exchanged glances. There was no question of disobedience, only the anticipation of what came next. Thorn turned to Vale, his voice like steel. "We're taking the fight to them." She blinked but quickly recovered. "You mean—" "Yes." His eyes were dark, filled with something the Kroll had never thought possible from their human adversaries. Pure, unrelenting vengeance. "We go to war." The war drums of humanity had been silent for too long. Now they thundered across the galaxy. The Supreme Fleet departed. Ardent Prime as a force of reckoning, its warships cutting through space like celestial blades. The battle for the colony had been just the beginning. A declaration that humanity would no longer stand idle while the Kral Dominion ravaged their people. Their next destination was already chosen. Thorn stood on the command deck of the TSS Retribution, staring at the holographic projection of the Kral Dominion's nearest military stronghold, Draxion 5, a fortress world, a key staging ground for Kroll invasions, the kind of place that would make the Dominion believe itself untouchable. Admiral Thorn intended to shatter that illusion. The bridge hummed with activity, officers moving efficiently as they coordinated the fleet's formation. Every soldier aboard knew what this meant. The Supreme Fleet was no longer in a defensive war. This was humanity's counterattack. Captain Vale stepped up beside him, her expression sharp, determined. "Fleet reports. All systems go. The second wave of reinforcements will rendezvous with us at the edge of Kral space." Thorn gave a slow nod. "What's the latest on enemy activity?" Vale pulled up a secondary display. "Scouts confirm Draxion 5 is at standard defensive readiness. They don't know we're coming." That was their advantage. The Kroll still believed humans would lick their wounds, reinforce their borders, and wait for the next attack. But they had miscalculated. Thorn turned to his tactical officer. "Deploy stealth recon probes. I want continuous surveillance on Draxion 5's defenses. Any movement, any deviation, I want to know before they do." The officer saluted. "Aye, sir." Vale exhaled. "This is going to be different from Ardent Prime. We were on the defensive there, now we're invading their territory." Thorn's expression didn't change. "Good." Good. Vale arched an eyebrow. "You're not worried about overextending?" Thorn's lips curled slightly, a rare hint of amusement breaking his otherwise grim demeanor. "They underestimated us once, they'll do it again." He turned to her, his voice dropping lower, "And when they realize what's happening, it'll already be too late." The Supreme Fleet pressed forward, slipping into the darkness between stars, moving like a predator in the void. Humanity had come for its own. Now it was coming for blood. The Supreme Fleet arrived at the edge of Kral-controlled space, hidden within the shadow of a dense nebula. The void stretched endlessly before them, broken only by the distant glow of Draxion 5, a fortress world that had never been touched by war. Until now, Admiral Thorn stood in the dim light of the TSS Retribution's war room, surrounded by his senior officers. A massive holographic display flickered in the center, showing real-time surveillance of the planet Draxion 5 was heavily fortified. Planetary defense cannons, orbital shipyards, and entire legions of Kroll warriors patrolled its surface. It was not just a military base, it was a symbol of Dominion power. Captain Vale folded her arms, studying the map. A full frontal assault would be suicide. Thorn nodded. "That's why we're not doing that." He tapped a command into the interface, and the holographic display shifted, highlighting key points across the planet's defenses. The Kral think we'll attack them like they attack us. Overwhelming force, brute strength. His voice was calm and measured. We're going to do the opposite. A low murmur of anticipation rippled through the room. Vale leaned in, a surgical strike. Exactly. Thorn's eyes gleamed. Their planetary defenses are automated, but the command protocols are handled from inside their primary control station here. He pointed to a fortress embedded within the mountains. We take that out. Their entire planetary shield network collapses, then our fleet can wipe them out from orbit. A tactical officer frowned. They'll have elite guards protecting that station. If we send a ground team in, they won't make it out alive. Thorn gave a small, dangerous smile.
That's why I'm leading it myself. The room went silent. Vale stared at him. Sir. He held up a hand. I know what you're going to say. She took a step closer, voice low. Then you know it's insane. You're the Supreme Fleet's commander. You don't lead ground assaults. Normally no, Thorn admitted, but this isn't a normal war anymore. The Kral think we hide behind our ships and fight from a distance. They think we fear them. He leaned forward, eyes burning. They need to see that we don't.
Vale exhaled sharply, but didn't argue further. She knew better than anyone. When Thorn made a decision, it was final. The war room fell into motion. Orders were issued. Strike teams were assembled. The Supreme Fleet moved into position, and within the hour, Thorn was in full battle gear, standing aboard a dropship as it hurtled towards Zartal. His hands clenched into fists. The Kral thought their fortress world was untouchable. They were about to learn that when humans go to war, nothing is beyond their reach. The dropship rocked as it pierced Zartal 9's upper atmosphere, cutting through layers of thick, turbulent clouds. Below, the fortress world stretched out in a jagged sprawl of war factories, garrisoned outposts and towering citadels carved into the black rock of the planet's surface. The Kral had made this world into an unbreakable stronghold. Admiral Thorn was here to break it. Admiral Thorn. Inside the dropship's cramped interior, the strike team sat in silence. Weapons gripped tight, they were the best humanity had. Veterans of 100 battles, hardened killers who had seen the worst of war and survived. Their faces were calm and focused. There was no need for last-minute speeches. They all knew the stakes. Captain Vale sat across from Thorn, checking her rifle one last time. Her expression was unreadable, but Thorn could see the tension in her shoulders. She wasn't happy about him being here. Too bad? The ship jolted again as the pilot's voice crackled in over the comms. ETA 60 seconds. The stealth field is holding, but we'll have to burn hot for the final approach. Thorn nodded and turned to his team. We hit the ground. We move fast. No engagements unless necessary. The objective is the control station, nothing else. A chorus of affirmatives followed. No hesitation, no fear. The ship's rear doors groaned open, revealing the darkened landscape below. A massive Kral citadel loomed in the distance, carved into the mountains like a monument to their dominion. That was their target. The strike team leapt. Cold wind howled past Thorn as he plummeted his armor's thrusters, kicking in to slow his descent. Around him, his soldiers descended in perfect formation, dark shadows against the night. They hit the ground without a sound. The terrain was rough, jagged stone covered in thick layers of dust. High above, Kral patrol ships glided across the sky, oblivious to the humans that had just infiltrated their world. Thorn raised a fist, signaling the team forward. They moved like ghosts, slipping through the darkness, weaving between towering rock formations and outcroppings of twisted metal. The Kral had built defensive lines around the citadel, but they had never expected an enemy to land this deep inside their territory. A fatal mistake. The team reached the outer perimeter. Thorn crouched behind a wrecked Kral walker, scanning the defenses ahead. Guard towers, automated turrets, and a thick security gate blocked their path to the control station. Vale knelt beside him. "We're not getting through that quietly." Thorn smirked. "We don't need quiet, we need fast." He tapped his wrist controls, sending a silent command. A second later, the sky above them erupted in flame, orbital bombardment. The Supreme Fleet had fired on a Kral outpost miles away, setting off a chain of explosions that lit up the horizon. The distraction was instant. Sirens blared as Kral forces scrambled their attention, drawn to the distant attack. Thorn didn't waste a second. Go, the strike team surged forward, moving with lethal precision. Silenced rifles spat death as Kral sentries fell before they could sound the alarm. The team hit the gate, planting charges and ducking back just as the explosives detonated in a flash of searing heat. They were in. The control station was just ahead, a towering structure pulsing with energy. This was the nerve center of Zartal 9's defenses, the key to bringing the entire fortress to its knees. Thorn led the charge, cutting through Kral soldiers with brutal efficiency. Plasma fire lit up the night as the humans tore their way through the facility's corridors, leaving bodies in their wake. Then as they reached the core chamber, an alarm screamed through the structure. Reinforcements were coming. Thorn's jaw tightened. They had minutes, maybe less, before the entire Kral garrison descended on them. He locked eyes with Vale. "Get it done?" She nodded, already moving to the control terminal, fingers flying over the alien interface, almost there. "Just keep them off me!" Thorn turned to the entrance just as the first wave of Kral warriors stormed in. He raised his rifle. "Let them come!" The Kral warriors stormed into the chamber, their guttural war cries echoing against the metal walls. Their massive armored bodies moved with terrifying speed, plasma rifles raised, claws flexing in anticipation of tearing apart their human prey. Thorn didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger, his rifle barking with rapid bursts of fire. The first Kral in the doorway dropped, its chest cavity shredded by hypervelocity rounds. Another followed, but Thorn had already moved, rolling behind a terminal as enemy fire scorched the air where he had just stood. His strike team was right behind him. Sergeant Voss, a towering soldier built like a war machine, unleashed a stream of gunfire that sent two Kral warriors sprawling. Lieutenant Harris lobbed a flash grenade into the hallway, the sudden burst of light disorienting the charging enemies long enough for the team to reposition, but the Kral kept coming. Thorn ducked behind cover as a plasma bolt seared past his helmet, close enough to make his skin prickle from the heat. He risked a glance toward Vale. "How much longer?" he barked. Vale cursed under her breath, working furiously at the Kral control panel. "Their security protocols are a nightmare. I need another 60 seconds. They didn't have 60 seconds. The Kral were adapting fast, falling into a disciplined formation and firing in coordinated bursts. Thorn's soldiers returned fire, but they were being pushed back and forced into a tighter defensive position. And then the heavy footsteps came. A Kral warlord stepped into view, a towering, monstrous figure covered in reinforced armor plating. The creature carried a massive power axe, its edges humming with deadly energy, its cold reptilian eyes locked onto Thorn. "You will not leave this place alive, human." Its voice was deep, guttural, filled with absolute certainty. Thorn narrowed his eyes. "You talk too much." The warlord roared and charged. Thorn moved fast, raising his rifle and firing directly at the beast's face. The shots sparked against the Kral's thick armor, but barely slowed it down. In a single terrifying swing, the warlord's axe cleaved through the console Thorn had been using for cover, sending debris flying. Thorn rolled away, drawing his sidearm. He fired 3 precise shots, aiming for the gaps in the warlord's armor. One hit home, sinking into the creature's exposed neck, staggering the beast momentarily. The Kral swung again. Thorn barely dodged as the axe tore through the floor where he had been a second before. The The sheer force of the impact sent a shockwave through the room, knocking over a nearby terminal. Sparks rained down. Voss tried to intervene, unleashing a barrage of fire into the warlord's back, but the beast simply turned and swung its axe with brutal force. The blade caught Voss across the chest, carving through armor. The sergeant staggered, blood pouring from the wound. Thorn roared in fury and lunged forward. With one fluid motion, he holstered his pistol and pulled his combat knife. He ducked under the warlord's next swing, closing the distance before the massive alien could recover. Then he struck. The blade plunged into the Kral's throat, twisting deep. The warlord's eyes widened in shock. It tried to speak, but only gurgled as dark ichor leaked from the gash. Thorn didn't give it a chance to retaliate. He yanked the knife free and drove it in again, this time straight through the beast's skull. The warlord collapsed. The remaining Kral warriors hesitated. For the first time, they looked uncertain, and that was all the opportunity Thorn's team needed. Push forward. Vale shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "I've got control of the system." The entire facility shuddered as she activated the override sequence. Alarms blared, warning lights flashing red. Outside, the planetary defense grid flickered, its power surging wildly. Then silence. A moment later, Thorn's comm unit crackled to life. "This is Invictus's command. We are reading a full system shutdown. The planet's shields are down," Thorn grinned. "Then reduce this world to ashes." Above them, the Supreme Fleet descended like an avenging storm. Within seconds, the sky was filled with fire. Zartal 9 burned. From the sky, the Supreme Fleet rained destruction upon the fortress world, hammering its now defenseless surface with relentless orbital strikes. Explosions rippled across the planet's strongholds, war factories, and military installations. The Kral, once so confident in their unbreakable defenses, had nowhere to hide. Thorn and his team stood atop the ruined control station, watching the end unfold. Firestorms raged across the distant citadels, the once mighty Kral fortifications crumbling under the relentless assault. Their empire had relied on intimidation, fear, on the belief that no one would dare strike at their heart. Humanity had shattered that illusion. Thorn tapped his Comfleet status report. Admiral Hensley's voice came through, steady and satisfied. "Kral forces are in full retreat. Their fleet tried to regroup, but we obliterated them before they could escape. Zartal 9 is ours. Ours." Thorn exhaled, glancing at Vale, who was staring at the sky, her face unreadable. The others were silent, taking in the magnitude of what they had just done. The Kral had ruled through terror, conquering, enslaving, and wiping out entire species. They had believed themselves invincible. Now they knew fear. A sharp crackle on the comms broke the silence. It wasn't from their fleet. It was a broadcast, one coming from deep inside Kral space. The voice that spoke was strained, angry, but filled with something Thorn had never heard from the Kral before. War desperation. Humans. The guttural voice of a Kral high commander growled through the static. "You have sealed your fate. We will answer this act of war with annihilation. You cannot comprehend the storm you have unleashed." Thorn chuckled, shaking his head. He let the Kral talk, let them try to muster whatever was left of their arrogance. When they finished, he finally spoke, his voice calm, steady, undeniable. "We understand perfectly," he paused. "The question is, do you—" The transmission cut out. The Kral had no answer, because for the first time in their history, they weren't the ones doing the conquering. For the first time, they were the ones being hunted, and the Supreme Fleet was just getting started.